Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. Today I want to talk about Apple Records. And I got a big love for the whole idea of Apple Records. When I was a young lad, 11 years old, 1968, I bought the Beatles Hey Jude single. And it was the first single with the glossy black sleeve and that wonderful Apple label. And that record changed my life. And then the Beatles White Album, the first Beatles record on Apple, came out around Christmas of that year, and my life was changed completely. I was totally into music. And it got to be to the point where I would go to the record store, and it was always easy to spot the new Apple record releases with those black glossy sleeves. And I would buy pretty much anything I found on Apple, and I became a huge Badfinger fan and a huge Beatles fan. And I ended up buying John Lennon solo singles and Give Peace a Chance and Cold Turkey and all these things. And a lot of times I hadn't even heard them. I would just buy anything that came out on Apple. And I love the whole concept. I recently watched the documentary on Apple Records, and it was really fascinating, this whole idea of Western communism and running a label run by artists who were going to give a lot of new artists an avenue to get into the studio and have a record label, and it wouldn't be based on all the factors that normal record labels did. So, artist label run by artists for artists, and not as much involvement by the company as far as these bands. But it was a good idea that kind of went downhill. Of course, they started with a boutique with a bunch of clothes and the Apple boutique. And then they started signing artists based on word of mouth. And that's kind of when things started going south. Mary Hopkins was recommended to them because somebody just had seen her and thought she was interesting. And then Mal Evans, who'd been the Beatles road manager, recommended a Welsh band that were friends of his, the Ivies. And so they signed these acts based on kind of word of mouth and just kind of incidental. And through Paul McCartney's involvement, of course, they ended up having a huge hit with Mary Hopkin, and they kind of half-heartedly supported the Ivies. And then Paul McCartney took the reins. They changed their name to Badfinger, recorded "Come and Get It" exactly according to McCartney's blueprint. Had a huge worldwide hit, and so things looked pretty good. But as I said, the fact that they just kind of started signing artists on word of mouth just really wasn't a good way to run the label. And they had to work pretty hard to make successes out of the artists that they picked. And granted, they picked a couple of good ones to start with, Mary Hopkin, and who the band eventually became Badfinger. And then they initially signed Jackie Lomax as a publishing deal, and then put out a record by him, including an amazing backing band with Eric Clapton and some of the Beatles, and so the band members were kind of involved with some of the projects, but they got overwhelmed pretty quickly. And I think it's fascinating. They actually put out ads and said, if you're a musician or a band out there and you're interested, contact Apple Records and we'll see what we can do. And then they got deluged with tapes and were totally overwhelmed, and they didn't have the staff really to take the time to go through them. And then they had kind of a weird sense of what artists should be on Apple. And of course that continued through the latter days of Apple Records, when they spent tons of money and studio time on Yoko Ono, who didn't sell any records at the time. And now out of all the Apple releases besides the Beatles, Yoko Ono's records are the most revered and considered the most revolutionary. But then we had John signing up people like Elephant's Memory and David Peel on the Lower East Side, and George Harrison with the Radha Krishna Temple, and Ravi Shankar, and some of these pet projects. And I love all the diversity, and I love the good intentions. Although when you look at the interviews with Elephant's Memory, they weren't really allowed to do kind of the record they wanted to. It ended up being more of a John Lennon record with them playing on it. And So the original inspiration for Apple to be a label that bands could come in and do what they want kind of didn't turn out to be true. They really had to monkey fuck with Badfinger to get what they wanted. John Lennon really monkey fucked with Elephant's Memory to get what he wanted. George Harrison ended up working with Badfinger. So it's a real mixed bag, and it's really unfortunate because the Beatles were either uh, really directly involved and a little heavy-handed with some of these artists, or they were completely uninvolved. And when you watch the documentary, you see that a lot of Beatles' involvement with artists on the Apple label kind of came and went to different degrees at different times. But what's fascinating to me is all the artists that they turned down or weren't interested in. So it shows that it ended up being kind of a pet project for the Beatles, and nobody got really serious about really getting a roster of bands that were kind of ready to go and could have some success. And when you look at some of the bands, a lot of the tapes, I'd be really interested to see who's got all those tapes now. It'd be really interesting to see hundreds and hundreds of tapes from bands and artists all over the world that submitted tapes and just got lost in the shuffle. And apparently, some of them were the Steve Miller Band, the Easy Beats, the Turtles, even the MC5 all submitted tapes to Apple and just got lost in the shuffle. And apparently, John Lennon actually went out and saw the band Yes and thought they were kind of interesting, but it never went anywhere. And then the Blackberries black vocal group that ended up getting involved with Humble Pie at one point. All these bands submitted tapes to Apple and just got lost in the shuffle. And then some of the ones that didn't get lost in the shuffle that they had a chance to sign is all the more intriguing. Yes, being a good example, but also Crosby, Stills, and Nash. They actually went to London and auditioned in person, and George Harrison decided that wasn't what they were looking for. And even Led Zeppelin approached Apple with the tapes of their first album and were turned down, and the Beatles didn't think they had any place on Apple Records. David Bowie submitted, and they turned him down. And then some more intriguing examples is the band Trapeze, who admittedly on their first record was more of a pop slash R&B group, was offered a deal with Apple and ended up going with Threshold Records and thought that they would actually have more freedom, which is interesting for them to decide they wouldn't have that much freedom and creativity on Apple as opposed to going with Threshold Records. And then one of my favorite ones is the psychedelic hard prog band High Tide. Got a publishing deal through Apple. There's even an acetate floating around out there of High Tide on Apple. And granted, Apple was grooming the record and publishing rights to perhaps get them on another label, but it would have been fascinating for High Tide to actually come out on Apple Records. And there's a lot of wild stuff on Apple, so it's not completely out of the question. They are obviously intrigued by High Tide, and it would have been just absolutely fascinating to see them get released on Apple. But it shows that aside from their best intentions and their concept of an artist label representing other artists and giving them full creativity and access, it turned out to not be true, and they had a chance to get a lot of major artists. One of the ones they did have success with James Taylor, but they allowed him to kind of slip away. And that's one of the things that's kind of good about Apple, the way they worked. They would sign these artists, but they wouldn't hold them to these hard contracts. So it was really easy for James Taylor to make his mark on Apple and then immediately go off to Warner Brothers. But the whole idea that they would turn down Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Led Zeppelin and David Bowie and Yes is really a true fuck up, and it shows that the band, aside from all their good intentions, didn't have a great vision for what Apple could become, and didn't have the wherewithal to look at some of these artists like Crosby, Stills, and Nash and realize they had something special, and it could have made Apple a completely different label than what they were. And it's a shame that didn't happen. But anyway, I just wanted to do a video on that because when I dug around a little bit more, I was really surprised at all the artists that Apple turned down, and it shows that as great of musicians and songwriters and singers and creative visionaries as the Beatles were, uh, their viewpoints between 1968 and 1970 particularly, and also going into the early 70s, they didn't really have the vision to see some of these great artists and take advantage of it and have them come out on Apple. So an interesting slice of history. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.